The UK FTSE 100 now has a dividend yield above 5%, and it's consistently had a dividend yield above 4% for the last 5 or 10 years. Now, a lot of people are saying, does this mean that the FTSE 100 is a better buy than the US markets like the S&P 500, the Dow Jones, the Nasdaq, and so on, especially when you consider it hasn't performed as well in the last 20 years as the US markets? Now, what I would say is this: the dividend yield that an index can provide is important. Indeed, Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard, said that a dividend yield, and always a high dividend yield, is one of the key things to look out for when it comes to investing. So therefore, even though nobody can predict where an index will go, if the dividend yield goes too low, like 1.5%, 2%, whatever, which the S&P was at, at different times in the last few years, that's not always a good sign. Whereas a high dividend yield is a good sign. However, I would add some caveats. Number one, as Bogle also said, markets are not always efficient, but they're not stupid. If the UK market seems more fairly priced and even much more undervalued compared to US markets, that is a sign, though, that the market realizes that the UK is more risky. Emerging markets is much the same. Emerging markets in the last 5 or 10 years have consistently underperformed the US market. So you might say, well, it's a great time to invest in emerging markets. That might be true. And being diversified is fine. Having 10% in emerging markets is fine. But bear in mind, don't assume that just because a market has underperformed for a few years, it's always going to outperform in the future. Look at China. Hasn't done well for 14 years, the Shanghai Composite. I'm sure it will at some time in the future. But the point I'm making is this, is that if you invest in the UK market, especially if you're not a British person, you've got currency risks, you've also got a few more risks compared to the US. So my summary really would be, if you're a British investor, of course, having some assets in the FTSE 100 makes a lot of sense because it's got a good dividend yield. And even better, if you go onto the FTSE All-Stars with the FTSE 250, 350, you're even more diversified. That means that if one index does better than the other, for example, the 250 has always been the growth index, whereas the FTSE 100 has been more like a dividend index recently. That's fine. But if you're a non-British investor, I wouldn't automatically think, wow, this is a great buy, because you've got a lot more risks, including currency risks, right? So having it as a portion of your portfolio is fine, but you can get that through MSCI World. So there's no reason for non-British investors to actually rush to the FTSE 100 just because it has a higher dividend than the S&P 500 and just because it looks more undervalued.